Imagine a world where half the population is erased from history. For thousands of years, the vibrant lives of ancient women have been silenced, their stories buried beneath the sands of time. What if I told you we could unearth them, revealing the queens, priestesses, and everyday heroes who shaped civilizations but were forgotten? Get ready to hear the voices you were never taught existed.
Below the golden blush of a dying sun, the world of forgotten empire shimmered like an echo suspended between myth and memory. The vast canvas of antiquity had always been painted with the triumphs of kings, warriors, and conquerors, whose names echoed in every surviving inscription. Yet beneath that towering masculine narrative, another current flowed, quiet, fierce, and undying. This was the realm of the women whose hands shaped civilizations, whose minds forged revolutions, and whose spirits moved continents long before the ink of history ever reached their names. Their stories did not survive as carved monuments or imperial decrees. They lingered in the fractures of clay tablets, in broken potteries dug from abandoned cities, in whispers passed down by mothers to daughters, each retelling fighting to keep their legacies alive. And so begins an excavation, not of ruins, but of the truths buried within them. The world thousands of years ago was neither silent nor primitive. It breathed with the complexity of cultures rising and falling like tides. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Nubia, the Indus Valley, the Hittite realms, the Shang dynasty, the Menominee Islands, each cradled stories of women who moved in the spaces between power and survival. Some ruled empires openly, some manipulated politics from behind palace curtains, and others shaped the intellectual, agricultural, or spiritual foundations of entire nations. Yet most vanished from the grand narrative because they did not write history, they inspired it. What survived instead were fragmented pieces of their voices, and in those pieces lies the possibility to reconstruct lives erased by time. In the early dawn of civilization, long before the pyramids reached for the sky, a young Sumerian woman named Enheduanna held a reed stylus and pressed symbols onto wet clay. No one knew that this girl, living in the bustling city of Ur, would one day become the world's first known author, a title seldom mentioned without hesitation or doubt. She was a high priestess, yes, but she was also something larger than religion. She was a mind that crystallized human experience into poetry, giving shape to emotions through a medium that had barely begun to exist. The hymns she wrote still breathe with longing, power, rebellion, and devotion. Yet her achievements were eclipsed by the kings whose epics dominated literature. Her story would become the first among many, proof that the foundation of human creativity was not gendered, but universal. Far to the west, the desert winds carved the land of Kemet, Egypt, where the Nile pulsed like an eternal heartbeat. Here, the image of women was etched not as shadows, but as essential pillars of cosmic balance. Royal women were guardians of dynastic legitimacy. Priestesses were interpreters of divine will, and ordinary women possessed legal rights unmatched for millennia. Yet even in such a society, the stories of the women who shaped Egypt from the shadows were muted. Everyone recognized Hatshepsut, the queen who crowned herself pharaoh, but few remembered the women who came before her, women who built Egypt's political machinery long before kings claimed their glory. And among them was Merneith.
Merneith, a figure standing at the edge of myth and history, lived during the First Dynasty, a time so ancient that even the Egyptians themselves hardly remembered it centuries later. She may have been the first female ruler of Egypt, her power shimmering through the fog of fragmented archaeological evidence. A single seal carved with dignity, a tomb rivaling that of kings, and inscriptions linking her to royal succession, all hinted at a truth never fully spoken. Her story is not the tale of a queen who ruled in opulence. It is the tale of a woman who stepped into a kingdom trembling under instability. She ruled not because she sought power, but because power demanded her. The cradle of pharaonic civilization survived because she held the delicate threads of unity together, ensuring that Egypt, a new and fragile experiment, did not collapse before it could rise. Yet Egypt was not alone in its silent reliance on women. To the south lay Nubia, fierce, brilliant, and often overshadowed by its northern neighbor. Here, women did not merely influence political affairs, they led armies, negotiated treaties, commanded respect, and built traditions that celebrated feminine strength. One such figure was the Kandake. Not one woman, but a title. Queen mothers who ruled with more authority than most kings. Their stories were recorded by foreign conquerors who underestimated them, only to face their wrath on the battlefield. But long before these queens clashed with Roman generals, they forged cities, supervised trade routes, and presided over one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the ancient world. Their power was unquestionable, yet history wrote their names only when they resisted outsiders. Their achievements, their nation-building, their diplomacy, those were left in ruins, while their defiance alone survived. Far to the east, in the fertile lands of the Indus Valley, women walked silently through a civilization that left no kings, no queens, no palaces, and no lavish inscriptions behind. The absence of such symbols puzzled archaeologists, but it also whispered of a society where power might have been distributed differently. Figurines of women uncovered in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro portrayed not goddesses of conquest, but mothers, nurturers, leaders of domestic stability, and possibly even administrators. The Indus cities thrived not through war or rigid hierarchies, but through trade, unity, and urban planning so advanced that modern cities still emulate their drainage systems. The women of this civilization shaped their world not through political titles, but through the rhythms of daily life and the mastery of craft and knowledge. Their influence was quiet but profound, like the steady flow of a river shaping stone. Across the Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, the Minoans carved a different narrative. Here, frescoes revealed women in roles usually reserved for men. Priestesses leading ceremonies, athletes performing alongside men, women engaged in diplomacy and cultural expression. The snake-haired goddess, or the mother goddess, was more than a deity. She represented a worldview where creation and destruction were intertwined with femininity. Women were central to ritual and spiritual life, shaping values that defined their civilization. The Minoans flourished under the influence of both male and female leadership, living in an equilibrium that was rare in the ancient world. Their island was a sanctuary where art, architecture, and trade blossomed, and women stood at the forefront of cultural innovation.
From the banks of the Yellow River emerged another dynasty, one wrapped in oracle bones, bronze vessels, and ancestral worship, the Shang dynasty of early China. Here, women were largely depicted as secondary to the patriarchal structure, yet history left behind traces of exceptional individuals who shattered the boundaries of their time. One such woman was Fu Hao, a warrior, priestess, general, and wife of King Wu Ding. She commanded armies, conducted rituals, and even supervised diplomatic missions. Her tomb, discovered thousands of years later, revealed weapons, ritual items, and treasures that marked her as a figure of extraordinary influence. Her story proved that even within strict patriarchies, exceptional women carved space for themselves through sheer capability and intellect. Throughout these ancient worlds, women were not merely figures of domesticity or symbols of fertility. They were strategists, creators, architects of culture, and keepers of knowledge. Yet as centuries passed and patriarchal societies rewrote history, their achievements dissolved into footnotes. The great irony of civilization is that those who contribute the most often remain the least remembered. But memory is not static. It can be revived, reconstructed, and reclaimed. And the earliest civilizations offer us more than ruins. They offer us clues, each waiting to be pieced together to reveal the hidden half of humanity's story. The story begins in a world where the first sparks of urban life flickered into existence. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, a young girl named Shala walked through the streets of Uruk. Traders shouted, musicians performed, potters shaped clay, and scribes etched the earliest forms of writing. Shala was not royalty, nor was she destined to become a priestess. She was a curious observer, a child of ordinary beginnings whose life would intersect with extraordinary women. Her perspective would serve as the thread binding together the diverse stories of distant civilizations. Through her eyes, the world became a tapestry woven from the experiences of women like Enheduanna, Merneith, the Kandakes, the women of Harappa, the priestesses of Crete, and the warriors of the Shang dynasty. As the sun set over Uruk, Shala's grandmother told her stories about the women of old, stories not written on tablets, but carved into the memories of those who refused to let them fade. She spoke of Enheduanna's words that once moved mountains of belief, of queens who ruled in times of crisis, of warriors who faced death without fear, and of mothers who raised generations strong enough to build empires. With each story, Shala felt a stirring within her, an urge to seek out the truth behind these legends. She wanted to know how these women lived, why their stories were forgotten, and what could be discovered if someone dared to look beyond the surface. One night, as Uruk prepared for the festival of Inanna, Shala gazed at the sky, where stars shimmered like ancient eyes watching over the world. She felt as if the past was calling to her, urging her to preserve what remained of forgotten lives. In the quiet of that moment, she made a promise to follow the traces of these women wherever they led her, across deserts, rivers, mountains, and seas, into the heart of empires both known and lost. Her journey would not be one of conquest, but of discovery. And through her journey, the unsung stories of women who built empires would rise again, no longer hidden in the shadows of history.
The festival lights flickered across the streets of Uruk as Shala stepped deeper into the crowd, following the rhythm of drums echoing like distant thunder. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of roasting grains and sweet dates. The celebration honored Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility. Yet to Shala, the night symbolized something more. A gateway into the forgotten realm of ancient women whose stories pulsed beneath the veneer of myths. Her grandmother's tales had drawn her into a world beyond ordinary life, a world begging to be remembered. As dancers circled the temple courtyard, Shala's gaze wandered toward the high priestesses, dressed in ceremonial robes, their faces solemn under the flickering torches. Among them, a woman stepped forward, her voice rising in a chant that rippled across the gathering. It was a hymn older than memory, a composition once written by the very woman Shala longed to understand, Enheduanna of Ur. Though generations had passed, the melody still carried the fierce devotion and poetic mastery that had defined her existence. Hearing it stirred something deep within Shala, as if the ancient author whispered directly into her soul. The presence of tradition enveloped her, but her curiosity reached beyond ritual. She wondered how Enheduanna had risen to such prominence in a world where hierarchies ruled every aspect of life. What had compelled her to write? What emotions lay buried within her hymns? Shala imagined the young Enheduanna sitting under lamplight, her hands gliding across clay tablets, each symbol an act of rebellion against silence. She became determined to learn more, and with that determination came the realization that her journey had already begun. When dawn broke the following day, Shala set out on her first step toward uncovering the truth. She approached the temple school, a place where the elite learned the art of writing. The master scribe, an aging man named Beled, watched her with raised brows as she stood before him. Few girls ever approached him for knowledge, and even fewer were allowed to enter. Yet something in her unwavering gaze made him pause. Perhaps it was the spark of Enheduanna's legacy, or the persistence of a child who refused to be dismissed. After a long moment of silence, he sighed and motioned for her to follow him inside. Within the dim interior, clay tablets lined the shelves like silent guardians of memory. Beled handed her a lump of fresh clay and a stylus, watching how she held them. She felt a tremor of excitement as she shaped the material. Her first symbols were crooked, unrefined, and almost unreadable. But Beled did not laugh. Instead, he leaned closer and whispered that every master began with a single imperfect line. The words comforted her, igniting her desire to learn more.
Shala visited the school daily, her fingers growing more confident with each passing week. As she practiced, Beled shared stories preserved on tablets, records of trade agreements, chronicles of kings, hymns dedicated to gods, and administrative lists documenting market transactions. But what fascinated her most were the rare tablets attributed to Enheduanna. Beled had only 2 fragments left, both cracked and faded, but he guarded them with reverence. Shala would stare at the jagged lines, trying to imagine the woman who had written them. It felt as if every missing piece of clay held a missing moment of her life. One evening, after the lessons ended, Shala ventured toward the riverbank. The Euphrates shimmered under the moonlight, reflecting the constellations that guided travelers across Mesopotamia. As she walked along the water's edge, she noticed a group of merchants gathered around a storyteller. She slipped into the crowd, eager to listen. The storyteller spoke of ancient queens who once ruled far beyond the sands, women of Egypt who commanded armies and shaped destinies. The story centered on a woman named Mythology, a ruler whose authority once stabilized an entire kingdom during its infancy. The storyteller's voice rose and fell like the river currents, weaving an image of a queen forgotten by most, yet preserved in the whispers of time. Shala's heart raced. This was no coincidence. It felt as though the world itself urged her to follow the trail of these women. The thought of Mythology, a woman who might have been the first female pharaoh, filled her with awe. She resolved to learn more, even if it meant traveling beyond her homeland. But she was not ready yet.
For now she would gather knowledge, collect stories, and prepare herself for the long journey ahead. Days turned into weeks, and Shala found herself immersed in studies and stories. Beled began treating her not merely as a student, but as an apprentice. She learned to interpret symbols, trace genealogies, and understand the myths that shaped her civilization. Yet the more she learned, the more she realized how many women's stories had been erased or overshadowed. Whenever she questioned Beled about female rulers or scholars, he would shrug and say the records were scarce. But Shala refused to accept scarcity as truth. She believed the stories existed somewhere, buried, obscured, or waiting to be found. One afternoon, Beled handed her an old, nearly crumbling tablet. Its surface bore markings unfamiliar to her. He explained that a wandering trader had brought it from the west, Egypt. Though Beled had deciphered only fragments, he insisted Shala examine it. She held the tablet carefully, her eyes scanning the symbols. The script was different, more elaborate, but she sensed the weight of its history. Beled explained that it contained references to a royal woman whose name was partially lost due to erosion. Yet even the fragment hinted at her political role. Shala felt a thrill of discovery. This was the link she had been searching for, a tangible connection to another civilization's forgotten women. She spent hours studying the tablet, tracing every line until her fingers ached. Through this piece of clay, she felt closer to Meneth than ever before. It was as if the tablet held a voice frozen in time, waiting for someone to listen.
As days passed, her fascination with Egypt deepened. She read accounts of early dynasties, studied their burial practices, and memorized the names of rulers preserved in ancient records. Though most histories centered on men, she sensed the presence of women woven into the fabric of every narrative. They were there, in marriage alliances, diplomatic negotiations, religious rituals, and even in succession crises. Their stories simply required a different kind of reading, one that looked beyond what was written to uncover what was left unsaid. Shala began documenting her findings on clay tablets, shaping her own archive. Balad encouraged her curiosity, though he warned that the path she followed might lead her far from home. She did not fear this possibility. Her heart yearned for discovery, for understanding, for connection across centuries and continents. One night, as she sat near the lamplight, her grandmother approached her. The old woman's eyes glimmered with pride and concern. She listened as Shala described her desire to journey beyond Mesopotamia someday. Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and reminded her that stories were powerful, enough to shape civilizations, enough to outlive the people who told them. She urged Shala to carry her voice with humility, for those who seek lost truths must be prepared to face both wonder and sorrow. The conversation lingered in Shala's mind long after her grandmother left. She looked at the clay tablet she had written, imagining what future generations might think of her words. Would they see her as a seeker of forgotten voices? Would her own story matter? These questions pierced her thoughts, yet they filled her with renewed determination. If the women she sought had lived boldly, she would follow in their footsteps with the same courage. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. One morning, traders from distant lands arrived in Uruk, filling the streets with foreign goods: gold from Nubia, papyrus from Egypt, dyes from Phoenicia, and spices from the Indus Valley. Their arrival created a frenzy among locals, who rushed to buy exotic items. But what captivated Shala most was their stories. She listened as they described lands where women held surprising power. One trader spoke of queens in the far south, Kandakes, who led Nubia with unparalleled authority. He described their fierce leadership, their negotiations with foreign powers, and their role in expanding trade routes. Shala was mesmerized. Nubia sounded like a kingdom where women's power was not an exception, but a tradition. The idea thrilled her, deepening her desire to journey beyond Mesopotamia. Another merchant shared tales of the Indus Valley, where society operated differently from Mesopotamia or Egypt. There were no massive temples or grand palaces, but there was order, artistry, and balance. Women were believed to play key roles in maintaining household and community harmony. Figurines discovered by modern archaeologists hinted at a reverence for female forms, perhaps goddesses or symbols of empowerment. Shala listened with open eyes, realizing that every civilization had its own narrative thread linking women to the foundations of culture.
Weeks later, Beled surprised her with news that a caravan would soon depart for Egypt. The journey would be long, difficult, and filled with uncertainty, but it was also an opportunity to see the world she had studied from afar. Shala felt her heart leap with excitement and fear. Leaving Uruk meant leaving her family, her teacher, and the familiar rhythms of her life. Yet she knew the stories she sought awaited her in distant lands. Her grandmother embraced her tightly, whispering blessings and warnings. Beled gifted her a stylus crafted from polished bronze, a token of her progress and a symbol of her mission. The morning of her departure arrived with a sky tinged in shades of lavender. Shala walked toward the caravan, where camels, laden with goods, knelt patiently. The traders greeted her warmly, some curious about her presence, others skeptical. But she held her head high, determined to prove herself. As she mounted the camel assigned to her, she glanced back at Uruk, its ziggurats rising proudly against the horizon, the city that had shaped her. The caravan set off, moving slowly across the desert. The sun blazed, the wind carved patterns in the sand, and the world stretched before her like an endless mystery waiting to be unraveled. With each step forward, she felt the weight of the women whose stories she carried, Enheduanna's poetry, Merineth's legacy, the Kandaki's strength. They marched beside her, guiding her path. As the days turned into weeks, Shala found herself strengthened by the hardships of travel. She endured scorching heat, freezing nights, and unexpected sandstorms. Yet she remained resolute, driven by a purpose larger than herself. Whenever she felt weary, she would touch the bronze stylus hanging from her neck, reminding herself of the journey she had chosen. Finally, after countless days of crossing desolate landscapes, the caravan reached the Nile. The sight of the river overwhelmed Shala. Its waters shimmered like molten gold under the sun, lined by lush green banks and towering palms. This land was unlike anything she had seen, alive, fertile, and steeped in ancient magic. She felt as though she had stepped into the heart of history itself. As they traveled deeper into Egypt, Shala observed the grandeur of temples, the complexity of hieroglyphics, and the reverence given to royal women. She learned from local storytellers, priestess and traders who shared tales of queens and priestesses whose names were spoken with honor. Though Merineth belonged to a time so ancient that even Egyptians struggled to recall her fully, the legacy of strong women lingered in their culture. Shala's journey had only begun. With each new story, each new discovery, she felt the voices of forgotten women growing louder, urging her onward. She would uncover their truths, piece by piece, until their names shone as brightly as the empires they helped build. The wind sweeping across the desert carried with it a strange blend of warmth and mystique as Shala and the caravan advanced along the banks of the Nile. Days of travel had dulled the initial shock of Egypt's grandeur, yet every new town, every temple, every stone carved with lifelike precision rekindled her awe. She felt as though she had stepped not just into a foreign land, but into a living chronicle, one written by hands that understood both eternity and fragility. The Nile itself seemed like a spine of memory, holding together fragments of countless stories, many of which had never crossed the borders of Egypt. Shala traveled with traders, priests, and scribes who were eager to talk about their homeland. Their conversations opened a doorway into the past, a world where women, though sometimes veiled behind the prominence of kings, wielded a silent but profound authority. Whenever Shala listened to these accounts, she sensed the lingering presence of the forgotten queen she sought, the woman known only through fragments and speculation. She imagined Mernith walking the corridors of an early palace, wearing the double crown not as a symbol of ambition, but of necessity. Egypt during her time was still young, its political identity still forming. Power often faltered, and unity depended on those with enough wisdom to guide it. Shala envisioned Mernith balancing the fragile threads of dynastic legitimacy, ensuring that the kingdom did not fracture under pressure. Whether she was officially titled pharaoh or not seemed irrelevant compared to the role she played. The true force of history often lay in actions, not titles. Shala accompanied the caravan to the city of Abydos, one of ancient Egypt's most sacred places. Its colossal temples cast shadows that seemed to shelter buried secrets. Here, as pilgrims gathered to honor ancestral kings, Shala felt the weight of antiquity press on her chest. She wandered through the temple corridors, her fingertips brushing against walls carved with hieroglyphs older than many civilizations she had learned about. Every surface seemed alive with stories, myths, wars, triumphs, and rituals, but rarely did any mention the women who shaped them. She wondered how many queens, priestesses, or administrators had walked these paths, their footsteps erased simply because chroniclers had chosen to focus on men. Inside one dimly lit chamber, Shala encountered an elderly priest translating inscriptions for a group of visitors. His voice resonated softly through the cool air. He explained how early dynastic women sometimes acted as regents, especially when the heir was too young to rule. It was in these transitional periods that women like Mernith emerged as stabilizing forces. Shala listened intently, absorbing every detail. When the crowd dispersed, she approached the priest, asking about surviving records of early queens. He smiled at her curiosity, something he seldom encountered from travelers so young. He admitted that evidence was scarce, but encouraged her to seek the royal cemetery at el-Kahab, where early pharaohs were buried. There, he said, she might find the silent tombs that protected stories older than written history.
The following morning, Shala traveled with a small escort toward the burial grounds. The journey led her across golden dunes that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. As they approached the necropolis, the desert wind seemed to hush, as though aware of the sanctity of the place. The tombs, though eroded by millennia, stood firm like sentinels guarding Egypt's earliest rulers. Shala walked among them with reverence. She paused before a tomb bearing the name Mernith. Though damaged, the stone still retained a regal aura. Standing before it, Shala felt an unexpected surge of emotion, something deeper than admiration. It was connection. A girl from the Mesopotamian plains stood face to face with a woman who had carried the burden of an empire thousands of years before her birth. She closed her eyes and imagined Mernith not as a figure carved into stone, but as a living woman navigating the tumultuous early years of Egypt's formation. She saw her sitting with advisors, negotiating with nobles, managing disputes between Upper and Lower Egypt, ensuring the continuity of a kingdom that could have easily splintered. Shala wondered whether Mernith ever questioned her strength or feared failure. She wondered whether the queen had longed for normalcy, or whether she embraced her role with unwavering resolve. These questions had no clear answers, but their presence alone made Mernith feel real, human, vulnerable, and extraordinary. Shala remained at the necropolis until sunset, sketching symbols she saw on various tombs, preserving them on clay tablets she carried. Each inscription felt like a small puzzle piece in the larger mosaic of women's forgotten legacies. When she finally returned with the escort to Abydos, she felt changed. Egypt was no longer just a distant land of gods and pharaohs. It was a landscape of human stories, many of which had slipped through the cracks of time. Days passed as Shala continued learning Egyptian script from local scribes. Some were amused by her questions, but admired her persistence. She grew increasingly aware of how many stories lay unrecorded simply because the storytellers had chosen not to write them. But she refused to let those silences define history. Every night she wrote her observations, determined to resurrect the narratives that history had failed to honor. One evening, as she sat by a small fire near the banks of the Nile, a boat docked at the shore. From it stepped a group of Nubian traders dressed in vibrant garments, adorned with gold beads. Their presence created a stir among the locals, for Nubians were renowned for their wealth, their craftsmanship, and their queens. Shala's curiosity ignited instantly. She approached their chief trader, a tall woman with sharp eyes and braided hair decorated with cowrie shells. The woman introduced herself as Yareta and spoke with a calm elegance that demanded respect. Shala listened as Yareta described her homeland, a place where women ruled not from behind curtains, but from thrones, where the title Kandake signified a queen mother whose authority eclipsed that of kings. Moreover, she told of Shala, an ancient queen of Nubia who had symbolized women's strength and resolve. The words hit her with the force of a revelation. Women ruling a kingdom, women whose significance was not dismissed. She felt their presence deeply in the Egyptian Nile, be present saying the same thing.
Shala felt a spark within her, the same spark that had drawn her to Enhedu and Mernith. Here was another civilization where women's leadership was ingrained in tradition. Yareta described how Kandake's negotiated treaties with foreign powers, commanded military campaigns, and oversaw economic expansion. Her voice carried pride as she recounted the tale of a queen who once confronted Roman invaders with fearless determination. But what struck Shala most was the way Yareta spoke, as though the power of these queens flowed through her veins. It reminded Shala that legacies did not fade if people chose to carry them forward. That night, Shala could scarcely sleep. Her mind swirled with visions of Nubian queens raising armies, strategizing diplomacy, and shaping their kingdom with brilliance and resilience. She realized her journey would not end in Egypt. She needed to continue south, follow the Nile deeper into Africa, and seek the stories waiting there. The world felt vast, but her purpose expanded with it. When she shared her intentions with the caravan leader, he hesitated. The route to Nubia was long and sometimes perilous, but he recognized her determination. After discussions and arrangements, it was agreed she could travel with the Nubian traders on their return journey. Yareta welcomed her warmly, pleased to see a young storyteller eager to uncover truths forgotten by most. The journey south on the Nile was unlike her desert travels. The river carried them through shifting landscapes, lush riverbanks, rocky cliffs, and villages filled with music and color. Shala felt as though she were sailing through a tapestry woven with cultural threads she had yet to understand. Yareta taught her phrases in her native language and explained the significance of Nubian symbols, attire, and customs. Shala absorbed everything eagerly, her clay tablets filled with new observations. As the boat glided deeper into Nubia, Shala felt the presence of another ancient world rising around her. The songs of the boatmen echoed across the water, carrying stories of queens whose names once commanded respect throughout the region. She imagined these queens standing on palace terraces overlooking the Nile, their crowns gleaming, their voices steady as they issued commands that shaped the destiny of their people. Their power was not a deviation, but a norm, and Shala found this realization liberating. Her journey was far from over, but she could feel the chorus of women's voices growing louder. Enhedu, Mirnaith, the Kandakes, they were no longer distant figures preserved in fragments. They were becoming companions on her path. Through their stories, she saw not only the past, but possibilities for the future. And as the Nubian boat sailed under a sky shimmering with stars, Shala knew she was moving closer to the heart of her mission, to restore the voices of the women who had built empires but were never given their due place in history.
The early morning sun cast shimmering ripples across the Nile as Shala journeyed deeper into Nubian lands. The landscape shifted gradually. Egypt's monumental stone temples gave way to rugged hills, patches of fertile land, and villages painted with warm earthen hues. Children ran along the riverbanks, their laughter echoing across the waters, while women carried baskets of grain with the graceful balance of trained artisans. Everything in Nubia felt different, earthier, more rooted in the pulse of the river and the resilience of its people. The air itself seemed to hum with the weight of stories yet untold. Shala watched Yareta, the Nubian trader who had become her guide, as she stood at the bow of the boat. Her posture exuded strength, her braided hair catching the light like threads of copper. There was something regal about her, something that reminded Shala of the ancient Kandakis she had imagined. When Shala asked whether the stories of those queens were still remembered in her homeland, Yareta smiled, a smile carrying both pride and sorrow. She explained that their names lived in songs, in oral traditions, and in the memories of families who traced their ancestry to generations of powerful women. But written records were scarce. The sand, the war, the passage of centuries, they had swallowed countless inscriptions and monuments. Yet what lived in the heart of people never truly died. As their journey continued, Shala sensed a transformation taking place within herself. The girl who had once sat before a temple school in Uruk was now crossing the heart of ancient Africa, carrying tablets filled with rediscovered stories. She felt heavier in some ways, burdened with responsibility, but lighter in others, freed by her growing understanding of the world. She often wondered whether the women whose stories she sought had ever expected someone like her to follow their footsteps thousands of years later. After several days of river travel, the boat approached a city unlike any Shala had seen before. Elephantine granite cliffs rose on both sides of the water, guarding the entrance to a vibrant settlement adorned with towers and sculptures. This was Napata, the spiritual and political center of ancient Nubia. As they docked, the rhythmic sound of drums filled the air. Dancers moved in swirling patterns, while elders recited histories in melodic chants. Everything vibrated with life, and Shala felt her heart beat faster with anticipation. Yareta guided Shala toward the heart of the city. Along the way, she explained that Napata was once home to Kandakis, who ruled entire regions, commanded armies, and negotiated with foreign empires. Their palaces stood near the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal, a towering sandstone peak believed to be the earthly home of gods. When the mountain came into view, Shala felt an inexplicable shiver. Its silhouette resembled a carved crown rising from the earth, watching over the kingdom like an ancient guardian.
At the base of the mountain lay temples dedicated to Amun and other deities, decorated with statues of kings and queens. But unlike Egypt, where male pharaohs dominated temple walls, here Shala noticed something unique: multiple carvings depicting women in positions of power. One relief showed a queen receiving offerings from nobles. Another depicted a woman clasping the hand of a god, symbolizing her divinely sanctioned authority. Shala traced the carvings with trembling fingers. These were not forgotten shadows. Their presence was etched in stone, preserved in the very architecture of the land. Inside one temple chamber, she encountered an elderly historian named Nakura. His white hair hung in thick locks, and his voice carried the weight of generations. He listened patiently as Shala described her journey and her desire to understand the women who shaped empires. Nakura's eyes softened, and he invited her to sit. He began recounting tales passed down through centuries, stories of queens whose bravery rivaled that of legendary warriors. He spoke of one Kandake who negotiated peace between rival tribes during a time of civil strife. She possessed a voice that could silence a crowd and a mind sharp enough to read any leader's intentions. Another queen, he said, led military campaigns along the Nile, her bronze-tipped spear becoming a symbol of resistance. But the most revered was the Kandake, who stood against foreign invaders, refusing to bow even when faced with overwhelming odds. Her arrows struck fear into enemy armies, and her defiance became a beacon of courage. The more Shala listened, the more she felt tears forming in her eyes. These stories were not merely narratives. They were lifelines connecting past to present, carried across generations by people who refused to let their queens fade into obscurity. Nakura explained that Nubian women were not just rulers. They were strategists, spiritual leaders, diplomats, and symbols of unity. Their authority did not require justification. It was woven into the fabric of their culture. In the following days, Shala explored Napata with new understanding. She visited markets filled with artisans who shaped jewelry from gold mined in Nubian hills. She observed weavers creating vibrant textiles embroidered with patterns that symbolized legacy and protection. She spoke with elders who told her how grandmothers passed on stories of resilience to children, reminding them that strength did not belong to any single gender. Everywhere she went, she felt the spirit of the Kandakes lingering like a protective presence.
One evening, Ureta invited Shala to attend a ceremony held in honor of ancestral queens. The gathering took place beneath the open sky, lit by torches that flickered like golden fireflies. Women stood in a circle, singing chants that seemed older than language itself. Their voices rose and fell in harmony, blending with the whisper of wind sweeping across the desert. In the center of the circle stood a young girl, no older than 12, wearing a necklace of polished stone. The elders placed a staff in her hand, symbolizing leadership, and blessed her with prayers for wisdom and strength. Shala watched the ritual with profound admiration.
It was not a coronation, nor a declaration of political power. It was a reminder, a living affirmation that every generation carried the potential to shape the future. She realized then that the stories she sought were not relics of the past. They were seeds scattered across time, waiting for someone to nurture them. As Charlotte prepared to continue her journey, Nakura gifted her a small wooden box. Inside it lay a carved figurine of a queen, its features delicate yet commanding. The figurine represented the spirit of the Kandakes, he explained. It was not meant to be worshipped, but to be remembered. Shala accepted the gift with reverence, vowing to carry the legacy with her wherever she went. Her next destination lay eastward, beyond deserts and mountains, toward one of the world's oldest civilizations, the Indus Valley. The journey would be long and uncertain, but her purpose was clearer than ever. She had seen how women shaped Nubia's strength. Now she wished to discover how they shaped a civilization that left behind cities without kings, yet built with unmatched precision. As Shala boarded another caravan preparing to travel across the Red Sea routes, she looked back at the towering peak of Jebel Barkal. The sun dipped behind its crown-like silhouette, casting a soft glow over the land. She whispered a silent promise that she would return someday, because stories like these were not to be taken and forgotten, but carried and shared. With the Kandakes in her heart and her mission expanding with every step, Shala moved forward once again, into the unknown, ready to uncover the voices of women whose power had shaped the world long before history remembered their names.
The journey eastward began with the rust-colored horizon shimmering beneath the relentless sun. Shala's caravan moved slowly across the dry stretches of land, leading toward the Red Sea. The Nubian winds still clung to her hair, and the memory of Jebel Barkal rose behind her like a shadow of courage she would carry forever. Yet ahead lay lands she had only heard of in fragments, civilizations that had left behind no grand monuments of kings, no towering inscriptions of battles, but cities of meticulous design and quiet brilliance. Shala's heart pulsed with anticipation. She was heading toward the Indus Valley. Traders whispered of this civilization with awe. They spoke of cities aligned with the stars, drainage systems centuries ahead of their time, workshops filled with artisans who crafted seals bearing mysterious symbols still undeciphered by scholars of later ages. Shala listened carefully during each night's rest, capturing every detail in clay tablets. Yet what fascinated her most was what these traders did not mention: names. No kings, no queens, no dynasties. It was as though the people of the Indus Valley had built a society where collective identity overshadowed individual fame. Shala wondered where women fit within such a world. Were they silent observers or silent architects? After weeks of travel, the caravan reached a port on the Red Sea. Ships with triangular sails rocked gently in the tide, ready to cross toward the lands reaching the mouth of the Indus. Shala boarded one, clutching her wooden box and bronze stylus as though they were extensions of her identity. The sea journey was rough. Waves rose like walls of liquid stone, and nights were filled with unfamiliar constellations. But amidst the shaking wood and salty winds, Shala felt a clarity she had never known. Each mile east felt like a step deeper into a mystery waiting to be unraveled. When the ship finally reached the western edge of the Indus civilization, Shala stepped onto land that smelled of wet earth and monsoon winds. The landscape was dramatically different from Mesopotamia and Nubia. The rivers were wide and gentle, feeding lush plains dotted with settlements that grew in harmony with nature.
Farmers led water buffalo through fields. Potters shaped clay on spinning wheels, and markets bustled with colorful fabrics and polished stones. Shala's destination lay farther inland, toward one of the famed cities, Mohenjo-Daro. The journey there unfolded through villages filled with warmth and cooperation. Women worked alongside men in fields and workshops. Their roles were not hidden behind palaces or confined to domestic chambers. They were present everywhere, in trade, agriculture, crafts, rituals. Shala took note of how balanced everything felt, as if the society thrived not through dominance, but equilibrium. When Mohenjo-Daro finally rose before her, Shala gasped. The city seemed alive with precision. Wide streets arranged in perfect grids, brick houses with uniform measurements, complex drainage systems that flowed beneath the roads, and public wells placed strategically throughout the settlement. Unlike the towering structures of Egypt or the grand temples of Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-Daro's beauty lay in its order, its subtle grandeur, its quiet intelligence.
As Shala wandered through the city, she felt something profoundly different. Women here were not merely participants in society, they were woven into its structure. She saw women managing households that connected directly to communal courtyards, women shaping carnelian beads in workshops, women leading rituals around sacred trees, and young girls learning craft patterns passed down through generations. There were no crowns, no elaborate thrones, no carved hieroglyphs describing rulers. Yet the presence of women was everywhere, strong and constant. Shala visited the Great Bath, a massive structure built from finely fitted bricks, filled with water that reflected the pale blue sky. Local guides explained that it was used for ritual purification, community gatherings, and ceremonies involving both men and women. No statue of a deity presided over it. The sanctity seemed rooted in the shared use itself. Shala marveled at the symbolism, purity, unity, equality, all embodied in architecture. She stayed in Mohenjo-Daro for several days, learning from local storytellers who preserved traditions orally. One elderly woman named Mira became her anchor. Mira possessed eyes that sparkled with a quiet knowledge, and hands lined with the traces of decades spent weaving patterns into cloth. She welcomed Shala with warmth that reminded her of her grandmother. During their conversations, Mira revealed that in their society, motherhood was honored not as a duty, but as a sacred partnership with life. Crafts, trade, medicine, and home management often passed through maternal lines. Women held deep influence in community decisions, though not through loud declarations, but through the steady guidance that shaped daily life. Mira showed her a series of small terracotta figurines, some of women with elaborate hairstyles, others of mothers carrying infants, and some of what appeared to be goddesses or symbols of fertility. Shala touched each figurine gently, sensing stories encoded within the clay. Mira explained that these were not idols of conquest, but reminders that creation, both physical and spiritual, was rooted in feminine energy. They celebrated continuity, balance, nature. The Indus Valley did not carve the names of its rulers into stone, because its foundations lay not in individuals, but in the collective harmony of its people. And within that collective, women stood as pillars. Shala felt a deep calm as she absorbed this philosophy. It was a stark contrast to the civilization she had seen before, where power resided in titles, hierarchies, and monumental inscriptions. Here, power flowed silently, almost invisibly, but no less strongly. The women of the Indus Valley were unsung not because they were forgotten, but because they were never separated from the community they nurtured.
As she walked through the city at dusk, lanterns glowing softly along the streets, Shala realized she was witnessing a rare insight, an ancient civilization where equality was not a battle, but a way of life. The hum of daily activity echoed like a heartbeat. She watched mothers teaching young girls how to grind spices, older women advising groups on community decisions, and artisans showing boys and girls alike how to craft beads. Every gesture felt rooted in a sense of shared responsibility. Yet the more she learned, the more she sensed an underlying sadness. Mira spoke softly of how floods, changing river patterns, and environmental shifts gradually eroded the stability of their civilization. People migrated, cities declined, and many traditions faded into silence. The names of their wise women, their leaders, their healers, none were inscribed for future generations. Their legacies lived only through artifacts buried under layers of earth. That night, Shala sat near the outskirts of Mohenjo-Daro, the hum of insects filling the air. She wrote fervently on her clay tablets, determined to immortalize the stories she had uncovered. She described the graceful terracotta figurines, the communal baths, the leadership of women embedded in daily life, and the philosophy of balance that shaped the entire civilization. She felt a deep responsibility to preserve what time had erased. Before she departed, Mira gifted her a small terracotta figurine of a woman with arms outstretched. It symbolized the one who nurtures the world. Mira said it belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. The figurine, she said, carried the strength of their ancestors. Shala accepted it with trembling hands, knowing she was being entrusted with something sacred. As she left Mohenjo-Daro, the morning sky was painted with hues of rose and amber. Shala looked back one last time, imagining the city at its peak, alive with cooperation, artistry, and the quiet strength of women who built their world not through conquest, but through connection. Her journey now turned westward again, but not back home. Another civilization awaited her, one born from islands and myths, marked by labyrinths, goddesses, and a culture where women stood as central symbols of life and power. She had heard faint whispers of it from traders, the Minoans of Crete. With the terracotta figurine from Mira cradled safely against her chest and the Kandake figurine tucked in her wooden box, Shala carried the voices of 3 worlds with her. Each step forward felt like a promise to the women who had shaped those worlds. And as she prepared to move toward the Mediterranean, her heart brimmed with a new sense of purpose. She would not allow their stories to vanish again.
The path westward stretched before Shala like an endless ribbon of dust and sunlight. Leaving the Indus Valley felt like parting from a dream, one filled with order, balance, and silent strength. As she moved farther away, the memory of Mira's gentle wisdom lingered in her mind, reminding her that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it flowed like a hidden river beneath the surface of life. Now, as Shala crossed unfamiliar lands and prepared for a voyage across vast seas, she carried the terracotta figurine close to her heart, feeling its reassuring weight with every step. Her destination lay far across the shimmering blue of the Arabian Sea, past the great deserts and into the cradle of island civilizations. Traders she had met earlier spoke of Crete, an island where art blossomed like flowers, where palaces rose without fortified walls, and where women took central roles in rituals, ceremonies, and perhaps even governance. They called it the land of the Minoans, a people whose legends had merged with myth. Shala's curiosity burned like a flame. She needed to see whether these stories held truth. After weeks of traversing harsh terrain, she reached a coastal settlement buzzing with maritime energy. Ships from distant lands unloaded jars of oil, rolls of fabric, baskets of spices, and glimmering copper ingots. The air smelled of salt, tar, and faraway stories. Shala embarked on a ship bound for the Mediterranean, her heart pounding with both excitement and fear.
She had crossed deserts, rivers, and plains, but the sea was a creature of its own, unpredictable and commanding respect. The voyage was long. The waters shifted from tranquil blue to stormy gray without warning. Some nights Shala lay awake beneath the open sky, listening to the creaking wood of the ship and watching stars that seemed sharper, brighter, and more ancient than any she had ever seen. She often thought of the women whose spirits she carried. Enhedu's intellectual fire, Myrnaith's steady rule, the Kandake's fierce leadership, and the Indus Valley women's quiet strength. Their stories formed an invisible circle around her, guiding her across the unknown. After days of rolling waves, the outline of mountainous land emerged on the horizon. As the ship approached closer, the coastline of Crete unfolded like pages of a painted manuscript, cliffs rising boldly against the sea, valleys rich with olive trees, and settlements built with elegant precision. Shala felt her breath catch. She had arrived at Naxos, the heart of the Minoan world. Stepping onto the island felt like stepping into another kind of ancient magic. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of herbs. Children ran freely through courtyards. Women carried baskets of freshly dyed wool, and musicians played soft melodies in the shade of fig trees. Everything seemed alive, vibrant, and overflowing with creativity. But what struck Shala most was the architecture. The palace of Naxos rose like a labyrinthine masterpiece, painted columns in deep red and black, frescoes depicting bulls, dancers, dolphins, rituals, and scenes of everyday life. Unlike the fortresses she had seen elsewhere, there were no towering walls here. It was as if the people felt no need to defend themselves from constant threats. This was a civilization built not around conquest, but around connection, trade, and artistry.
As Shala walked deeper into the palace, her eyes widened at the frescoes lining the hallways. Women appeared everywhere, running gracefully in athletic competitions, tending sacred rituals, holding serpents in their hands as symbols of renewal, and standing beside men as equals in ceremonies. Their images were painted with attention and reverence, not as decorative ornaments, but as central figures of cultural identity. In one chamber, she met an elderly Minoan scribe named Thrasios, who noticed her fascination. He approached her with a gentle curiosity, asking where she had come from. When Shala shared her purpose, her desire to preserve the stories of ancient women, his eyes lit up with recognition. He invited her to sit beside him beneath a fresco depicting a woman with flowing hair, her arms raised in ritual dance. Thrasios explained that the Minoans believed in balance between masculine and feminine energy. Their primary deity was a great mother goddess, a symbol of creation and protection. Women served as priestesses, performers, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They led ceremonies in peak sanctuaries atop mountains, communicated with the divine through dance, and wielded authority in both spiritual and social realms. He told her about ceremonies involving snakes, symbols of regeneration and transformation, and how women took central roles in them. Shala listened with wonder. Here, power was not taken by force, nor inherited through rigid dynasties. It lived in ritual, in spirituality, in shared cultural identity. She realized that the Minoans honored women not because they ruled through empires, but because they embodied the natural cycles of life. Their influence was painted on walls, sung in hymns, and etched into everyday customs. One afternoon, Thrasios took Shala to the palace's upper chambers, where sunlight filtered through intricately carved windows. In one room, she found a group of priestesses preparing for a ceremony. Their garments were layered with colorful fabrics, their hair styled with braids and beads. They moved with practiced grace, holding cups of oil, flowers, and instruments used in sacred rituals. When they noticed Shala, they welcomed her warmly, offering her a glimpse into their sacred preparations. As she watched them rehearse, Shala felt a familiar stirring inside her, the same feeling she had experienced in Uruk, in Abydos, in Napata, and in Mohenjo-Daro. The stories of these women were not separate threads, they were strands of the same tapestry. Creativity, leadership, nurturing, spirituality, resilience, these qualities flowed through civilizations like a heartbeat connecting them all.
Later that evening, Shala stood on a balcony overlooking the palace courtyard. Dancers performed in the torchlight, moving with steps that mimicked waves, animals, and celestial patterns. Their movements told stories of seasons, gods, and human journeys. She wondered whether one of these dancers would someday be remembered, or forgotten, by future generations. The thought fueled her determination anew. But not everything in Crete was idyllic. The Razios spoke of tremors beneath the earth, of volcanic rumblings far to the north, and of sudden waves that had once devastated coastal villages. Nature, as ancient and powerful as any queen, shaped the destiny of the Minoans. Shala realized that civilizations did not fall merely from human conflict, but from the unpredictable rhythm of the world itself. Yet even in the face of natural uncertainty, the women of Crete remained central pillars. They led rituals meant to appease the gods of the mountains and seas. They organized communities, preserved traditions, and passed down artistic knowledge. Their legacy was woven into everything Shala saw, from pottery adorned with swirling designs to frescoes celebrating femininity. Before leaving the island, the Razios gifted her a small folded piece of parchment. On it, he had drawn a labyrinth, a symbol he said represented both the complexity of life and the journey toward understanding. At the center of the labyrinth, he painted the silhouette of a dancing woman, her form open and free. Shala accepted the gift with gratitude, placing it carefully inside her wooden box beside the Nubian queen and the Indus figurine. As she prepared to board another ship headed north, toward the lands that would one day become Greece and later toward China, she looked back at Knossos one last time. The palace glowed in the fading light as if alive, whispering stories through its painted walls. Shala whispered a promise to the wind that she would carry those stories with her no matter how far she traveled. With the spirit of the Minoan women added to her growing constellation of voices, Shala stepped onto the deck, ready for the next chapter of her journey, one that would lead her to a land shaped by bronze, oracle bones, and the legendary presence of a warrior woman whose name echoed through the ages, Fu Hao of the Shang dynasty.
The voyage toward the eastern lands began under a sky painted with soft gold. Shala stood at the bow of the ship, watching the waves glitter like liquid silver beneath the morning sun. She had crossed deserts, valleys, and islands, but now she was moving toward a realm shaped by ancient myths, mysterious symbols carved into oracle bones, and dynasties whose shadows stretched across millennia. This land was China, home of the Shang, a civilization forged in bronze and steeped in spiritual authority. The sea grew wilder as the ship pushed north and then east. Storm clouds gathered, winds howled through the rigging, and waves crashed with relentless force. Shala held on to the railing, her hair whipping in the wind like a banner of determination. The figurines she carried in her wooden box, the Kandake Queen, the terracotta mother of the Indus, the Minoan dancer, seemed to anchor her spirit. She felt as though each of the women she had studied was guiding her forward, strengthening her resolve to unveil more forgotten truths. After many weeks, the coastline of the Shang territory appeared through the mist, rugged, forested, and veiled in the kind of silence that hides ancient secrets. Shala stepped onto land that hummed with an unfamiliar energy. The air smelled of pine, soil, and distant smoke from bronze workshops. Scholars, hunters, farmers, and spirit readers moved through marketplaces filled with pottery, silk, and carved jade. The rhythm of this land was different, deeper, more solemn, shaped by rituals meant to bridge the world of the living and the ancestors. Shala traveled inland with a group of local traders until she reached the outskirts of Yin, the capital city of the Shang dynasty. Bronze bells chimed in the distance, their tones echoing through the valley. She could see towering structures built from wood and rammed earth, decorated with totems, patterns of dragons, and symbols that resembled ancient pictographs. What fascinated her most were the oracle bones displayed at shrines, turtle shells and ox scapulae carved with questions to the ancestors. She realized that writing here was not merely communication, but a bridge to the spiritual realm. Among these carved symbols, she found repeated references to a woman's name, Fu Hao. Her heart quickened. Shala had heard whispers of this warrior queen from traders in Crete, but she had not expected her presence to be so deeply carved into the records of an entire kingdom. She sought out a scholar of oracle bones, an elderly man named Xuan, whose long gray beard and steady eyes embodied wisdom earned through decades of study. When Shala asked about Fu Hao, his eyes softened with reverence.
Shala felt a surge of respect as Xuan spoke. She imagined Fu Hao as a young girl, learning to wield a bronze axe, studying battlefield formations, and mastering the rituals required to speak to the ancestors. She was not merely breaking barriers, she was redefining what power meant within the strict hierarchies of the Shang dynasty. Shala understood that Fu Hao was a force of nature, one whose story survived not through silence, but through the bold marks left upon oracle bones. As Shala walked through the ceremonial grounds of Yin, she saw warriors practicing with bronze spears, their movements sharp and disciplined. It was said that Fu Hao had trained soldiers like these, teaching them strategies inspired by both ancestral guidance and her own intuition. Shala imagined the general standing among them, her armor gleaming, her commands echoing across the battlefield. Unlike many women whose legacies were erased, Fu Hao's story was preserved in the very foundation of the kingdom's written traditions. Xuan led Shala to the site believed to be Fu Hao's burial chamber. Though reconstructed over time, the ground still carried a sense of solemnity. Shala knelt, placing her fingers on the earth. She closed her eyes and felt an overwhelming sense of strength rising through the soil, as though the spirit of Fu Hao still pulsed beneath her touch. The image of the warrior queen came alive in her imagination, leading troops into battle, riding her chariot through swirling dust, performing rituals before ancestral altars, and advising the king with the clarity of a born strategist. Fu Hao's story filled Shala with a newfound intensity. Here was a woman who had carved her legacy into history with undeniable force. She was nothing like the quiet figures of the Indus Valley, nor the ritualistic dancers of Crete, nor the Kandakis leading from thrones. She was a warrior forged in the heat of conflict, a woman who wielded both blade and spirit with equal mastery. Shala realized that the world of ancient women was not a single narrative, but a spectrum of power, as varied as the landscapes she had crossed.
One night, during a ceremony honoring the ancestors, Shala sat beside a group of priestesses. The air was thick with incense, the sound of drums steady like a heartbeat. Flames flickered as offerings were placed upon the altar. The chief priestess lifted her hands toward the sky, chanting words that resonated through the silent crowd. Shala closed her eyes and imagined Fu Hao standing in that same place, centuries earlier, performing rituals to seek guidance before battle. The connection felt so vivid that she felt shivers run down her spine. As days passed, Shala realized that Fuhao's legacy was more than historic. It was alive. Children played games imitating her battlefield moves. Elders recited stories of her triumphs. Warriors invoked her name before training. In a world dominated by ancestral reverence, her place among the great spirits was unquestioned. Before she departed from the Shang lands, Swan gifted her a small bronze replica of a tiger-shaped battle axe, Fu Ha's famous weapon. The artifact was no larger than her palm, but it felt powerful, symbolizing courage, strategy, and unwavering will. She placed it in her wooden box beside her other treasures, feeling it complete the circle of stories she had gathered from different corners of the world. Shala now stood at the edge of her greatest realization. Each civilization she had visited had its own vision of power, identity, and womanhood. Yet across thousands of miles and countless generations, one truth remained constant. Women had shaped the foundations of civilization, not as silent figures, but as creators, warriors, strategists, leaders, and spiritual guides. As she prepared to journey westward again, weaving together all she had learned into a story meant for the future, Shala gazed up at the stars glowing above the shining horizon. She felt the presence of every woman whose story she carried: the poet of Ur, the queen of Egypt, the Kandaki of Nubia, the mother of the Indus, the dancer of Crete, and the warrior of Shan. Their voices rose like constellations in her mind, guiding her toward the final stages of her journey, where she would discover not only the stories of women, but her own place among them.
The road westward wound through mountains, forests, and endless horizons as Shala carried the stories of civilizations across her soul like sacred fire. Each new sunrise revealed a landscape that seemed to whisper the names of the women she had learned from. She walked with Enhedu's poetry echoing in her heart, Merneith's steadiness strengthening her resolve, the Kandakis's fierce leadership sharpening her courage, the Indus mother's quiet endurance calming her spirit, the Minoan dancer's fluid grace guiding her thoughts, and Fu Hao's warrior ethos burning beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat. Yet despite the richness these voices brought, Shala sensed there was still one missing. Throughout her entire journey, she had followed a thread of stories, fragments of forgotten histories woven together. But now she felt the thread pulling her toward a final destination, one that would complete the tapestry she had been stitching across continents. It was time to return west, not to Mesopotamia nor to Egypt, but to lands where myth and memory danced together like eternal partners. Lands where civilization was both born and reborn. Lands where ancient fires still glowed beneath ruins. Weeks later, she reached the shores of Greece, where sunlight shimmered on rugged cliffs and olive groves stretched across hills like silver carpets. This land had absorbed countless stories from travelers, poets, scholars, and conquerors. But Shala was not here for the tales that filled scrolls and legends. She sought something else, something deeper, more elusive. The stories of women who had nurtured the roots of Western civilization long before epic poets immortalized the deeds of men. As she traveled inland, she encountered ruins of ancient settlements where small shrines dedicated to goddesses stood quietly amid rubble. She noticed that long before patriarchal pantheons took hold, the continent had worshipped powerful female deities, guardians of earth, fertility, nature, and justice. These forgotten goddesses were the echoes of ancient priestesses who once led rituals, governed spiritual laws, and guided communities. Shala realized that even in places where later history diminished women's roles, their earlier presence still pulsed beneath the soil, like hidden embers waiting to ignite. In one mountain village, she met an elderly herbalist named Talia, who seemed to carry the wisdom of centuries in her steady hands. Talia welcomed Shala as though she had been expecting her all along. Her home was filled with bundles of dried herbs, pottery etched with ancient symbols, and scrolls preserved with meticulous care. When she learned about Shala's journey, her eyes softened with recognition, as though she had once walked similar paths herself. Over cups of herbal tea, Talia told Shala stories of early priestesses who tended sacred springs, women who mediated disputes among neighboring tribes, and midwives who were so revered that some considered them closer to the divine than kings. She spoke of labyrinth dances performed long before the island of Crete rose to prominence, rituals led by women who channeled the rhythms of nature through graceful movements. Shala listened in awe, realizing that the Minoan dancers she had met were part of a much older chain of traditions.
But Thalia had more to share. She revealed that long before gods like Zeus and Apollo dominated Greek mythology, communities worshipped earth goddesses, whose names were now nearly forgotten. Women served as their priestesses, healers, and protectors of knowledge. These women preserved medicine, astronomy, storytelling, and agricultural wisdom. They were the pillars of early Greek society, yet few names survived. Shala wondered aloud why their stories were lost. Thalia sighed softly and said that sometimes history is rewritten not because the past is forgotten, but because powerful voices choose which memories should survive. Shala understood the weight of those words. She felt it in the way Nebuchadnezzar's scribes had overshadowed Enheduanna, in how Egyptian kings eclipsed Mer-Nith, in how wars buried the stories of Nubian queens, in how the Indus people disappeared without a trace, and in how natural disaster silenced the Minoans. History was not a record, it was a battlefield. Thalia invited Shala to accompany her up Mount Parnassus, a place revered for its oracles and mysteries. The climb was steep, but Shala felt guided by an unseen rhythm, as though the mountain itself welcomed her. At the summit, where winds swirled in wild currents, Thalia led her to a stone platform overlooking a view so vast it made the earth seem infinite. There she recited a melody older than language, invoking the memory of ancient women who had once stood at this very spot to interpret dreams, advise leaders, and preserve harmony between humanity and nature. Shala felt the presence of these women rise around her, like invisible silhouettes, figures who carried knowledge not through weapons or monoliths, but through intuition, connection, and spiritual wisdom. For the first time in her entire journey, she understood that not all power needed to be recorded to be real. Some power lived through influence, rituals, and the subtle shaping of belief. Yet Thalia sensed something in Shala's silence. "You have gathered many voices, but you have not yet heard your own." Shala froze. The words struck her with a force she wasn't prepared for. She had spent her entire journey learning, listening, collecting, writing, never once considering that she too was becoming part of the story she sought to preserve. She looked at her hands, worn from travel, stained with ink and clay dust. These hands had traced the lives of women across continents, but she had never paused to trace her own.
Their reflections faded, and she saw herself stronger, wiser, transformed. For the first time, Shala realized that her story was not separate from theirs. Her journey had not been just an exploration, it had been an initiation. She had become a vessel, one meant to restore the voices of women who had shaped the world. She was not just a witness, but a continuation of the legacy she sought. Over the next several days,
Shala stayed in Thalea's village, recording stories from local elders, midwives, artisans, and storytellers. She learned of women who protected knowledge through song, who carved secret symbols into pottery, who healed children with herbs, and who guided communities through famine and storms. She began to understand how civilizations survived not only through kings, but through women who held society together when war, disaster, or political upheaval threatened to tear it apart. As she prepared to leave Greece, Thalea gifted her a small stone pendant shaped like a spiral. This symbol, she explained, represents growth, memory, and the journey back to oneself. Shala added it to her wooden box beside the axe of Fu Hao, the Minoan labyrinth drawing, the terracotta mother, and the Nubian queen. The box felt heavier now, not with weight, but with meaning. Her journey was nearing its final arc. She felt the pull of home calling her back, not just Uruk, but everywhere she had traveled. She had circled the ancient world. Now she must weave all she had learned into a story powerful enough to bring forgotten voices into the future. As she boarded the ship westward, the winds seemed gentler than before, as though they recognized her. She stood at the bow, the wind sweeping her hair back, and whispered a silent promise. "I will carry your names, I will carry your stories, and I will not let the world forget." With that vow, Shala sailed toward the horizon, ready for the final chapters of her journey, where revelation, transformation, and destiny awaited her return.
The long voyage westward felt different this time. Not a journey into the unknown, but a pilgrimage deeper into herself. As the ship cut through the waters, Shala stood at the bow every night, feeling the breeze wrap around her like ancient fingers weaving new threads into her destiny. Each ripple of the sea felt like an echo of the women whose stories she carried. She no longer felt like an outsider collecting fragments of history. She felt like the bridge between the forgotten and the future. When the shoreline of Mesopotamia finally appeared in the horizon, her heart tightened. It had been months, perhaps years, since she had left Uruk. The ziggurats rising in the distance looked both familiar and foreign. She wondered whether Beled, her old teacher, was still guiding students, or whether her grandmother still sat by the door, weaving tales into the dusk. She wondered whether the streets smelled the same, whether the festival drums still pulsed through the night air. But more than anything, she wondered how much she herself had changed. When she re-entered Uruk, the city felt smaller than she remembered, not because it had shrunk, but because Shala herself had grown. The vibrant markets, the frantic traders, the priests carrying bundles of incense, all seemed like scenes from a life she had lived in another world. People glanced at her with curiosity, as though sensing something unfamiliar, a confidence, a depth, a fire she had not carried before. She made her way to Beled's temple school. The old scribe was sitting beneath a stone archway, hunched over a tablet. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were still sharp. When Shala approached, he looked up. At first, his face carried no recognition. But when he saw the bronze stylus she carried, a gift from him years earlier, his expression shifted. His eyes widened, filling with disbelief and then pride. He asked nothing at first, merely embraced her as though welcoming back a lost daughter. Only after a long silence did he speak, his voice cracking with emotion, asking where she had gone, what she had seen, why her presence felt different, as though the dust of many worlds clung to her. Shala told him her story, not all at once, but in long, steady waves. She spoke of Enheduanna, Merneith, the Kandakes, the women of the Indus Valley, the Minoan priestesses, Fuahau, and the Greek priestesses of forgotten springs. She told him of symbols carved in oracle bones and seals pressed in soft clay, of calluses painted with sacred dances, of queens who led armies, and mothers who kept civilizations alive through quiet resilience. Beled listened without interrupting, the way one listens to sacred prophecy. When she finished, he placed his hand on her shoulder and said something she never expected. "You have become what you sought."
His words stayed with her for days. Shala returned home next, her heart pounding as she approached the familiar doorway. Her grandmother was sitting exactly where Shala had always seen her, weaving a basket slowly, her eyes soft but distant. When she saw Shala, her hands froze. Tears filled her eyes before a single word escaped her lips. She rose with surprising strength and held Shala tightly, whispering blessings into her hair. That evening, Shala sat beside her grandmother as she had done years ago. But this time, when the old woman began telling stories, Shala recognized echoes of the civilizations she had visited. The tales of wise women, brave queens, clever healers, and silent protectors. Stories that had seemed abstract to her once, now burned with new meaning. Shala realized that her grandmother had always known fragments of these truths. The stories had traveled across centuries, crossing borders and languages, surviving wars, migrations, and the slow erosion of memory. Over the next weeks, news spread through Uruk of Shala's return. Children followed her through markets, eager to hear tales of distant lands. Women asked for knowledge about healing herbs she had seen. Traders wanted stories from Egypt and Nubia. Priests asked about rituals from Crete and oracles from Greece. Even kings' messengers came quietly, curious about the warrior queen from the east, whose name was carved in bone. Shala became the vessel she had promised to be. But something deeper was happening. As she shared these stories, Shala noticed a shift, subtle at first. Young girls listened to her not with the passive curiosity of children, but with hunger, with longing, with the spark of new possibilities. Women who had lived quiet lives began asking questions they had never dared to ask. Elderly women approached her with tears in their eyes, confessing that they had always known strength lived inside them, but the world had never given them words for it. Shala realized the true purpose of her journey. Not merely to gather the stories of ancient women, but to awaken the ones living now. One night, Beled visited her grandmother's house. He brought with him clay tablets, hundreds of them, blank and waiting. He placed them before Shala and said that the temple council had agreed to let her write a new set of chronicles, ones that would preserve not the conquests of kings, but the legacies of women. At first, she hesitated. She felt unworthy of such a task, but Beled shook his head gently. "You have seen what none of us have seen. You have crossed worlds and brought back their voices. You must write." Shala began writing the next morning. Each tablet felt like an ancient pulse awakening. She wrote of Enhedu's quiet rebellion with her stylus, Merneith's stabilizing leadership, the Kandake's unbroken lineage of queens, the Indus Valley's mothers of harmony, the Minoan priestesses who danced the world into balance, Fu Hao, who commanded armies with the sharpness of a blade and a mind, and Greek women whose wisdom shaped myth and memory. Her hands moved quickly, guided by purpose rather than exhaustion. Days blurred into nights, nights bled into dawn, and still she wrote, etching history back into existence.
Yet the true transformation came not through her writing, but through the awakening it sparked. Young girls began gathering outside her home at sunset, sitting in circles as Shala told stories from her journey. The stories grew louder, richer, more vibrant. Mothers brought their daughters. Elder women brought their granddaughters. Soon boys came too, eager to understand the world beyond masculine myths. A movement began, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. Uruk changed. For the first time, women were invited into discussions at the temple school. Girls learned to read and write beside boys. Mothers proposed new ways to handle trade disputes. Priestesses were given more authority in rituals. Storytelling became a public event, and Shala became the center of a cultural rebirth. But not all welcomed change. A group of high-ranking officials felt threatened. They whispered that Shala was too bold, that her stories were dangerous, that she encouraged women to step beyond their place. Rumors spread that she had been influenced by foreign ideas meant to weaken the traditions of Uruk. Beled warned her gently to be cautious, but Shala refused to silence her voice. The tension reached its peak when the officials demanded to review her tablets. She knew that if she surrendered them, they would be destroyed. Everything she had written, everything she had fought for, would vanish like sand in wind. That night, Shala stood at the riverbank, clutching her wooden box. The moon reflected on the water like a silver path leading into the unknown. She realized something. If stories survived for thousands of years, despite wars and disasters, it was not because of clay tablets. It was because of people, because of memory, because of the fire passed from voice to voice. As she looked at the figurines inside her box, each a symbol of a civilization she had touched, she made a decision. Not all stories needed to be written. Some needed to be carried. The next morning, Shala gathered the children, the women, and even the men willing to listen. She began telling the stories again, not from tablets, but from her heart, her voice ringing with truth. The officials watched helplessly. They could silence a tablet, but they could not silence 1,000 voices learning to speak. By the time the sun set, the stories no longer belonged to Shala. They belonged to everyone. And that was how revolutions began. Not with swords nor stones, but with stories powerful enough to reshape the soul of a civilization.
The days that followed seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly intensity. Uruk was no longer the same city Shala had left behind, nor was she the same girl who had once walked its narrow streets with hesitant steps. Her voice now resonated like a pulse through the heart of the city, awakening memories buried beneath centuries of silence. The story she carried had become seeds scattered upon fertile ground, taking root in the minds of a generation eager for truth. But with growth came tension, and with tension came the sense that a turning point approached, one that would decide not only Shala's fate, but the future of her people's relationship with history. The officials who feared her stories grew more restless with each passing day. They held whispered meetings inside carved chambers of the temple, drafting proposals meant to silence her influence. They complained that Shala had stirred the women of Uruk into dreaming too boldly, that tradition was under threat, that the old ways were being disrupted by tales of foreign queens, warriors, and priestesses. But Shala had grown beyond fear. She felt the collective breath of ancient women behind her, urging her onward. The voices she carried were not meant to be caged. One morning, as the sun rose in a soft wash of gold over the ziggurat, Shala found herself summoned before the council. She knew this day would come. Beled walked beside her, his steps heavy with worry. Her grandmother, too frail to join, placed a kiss on her forehead before she left, whispering the same blessing she had given Shala on the day she first began learning the written word. Let truth guide your tongue, and courage guard your heart." Inside the council chamber, the officials sat in a semicircle, their faces stiff and unreadable. They laid her tablets before her, the ones filled with stories she had written of women across civilizations. Yet instead of reading them, they asked her a single question. "Why do you insist on elevating women who are long dead?" The question was meant as a trap, but Shala did not waver. She lifted her chin and answered with a calm born of thousands of miles of learning. "Because their lives shaped the world as we know it. Because you walk on roads their hands once built. Because your children speak languages whose roots they protected. Because history is not the story of kings alone, but of all who carried civilization forward. They deserve their place in memory."
Her words echoed through the hall like a quiet storm. A few officials flinched, others hardened their expressions. One demanded that she surrender her tablets to be archived, a thinly veiled word for destroyed. Beled stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger, but Shala stopped him with a gentle glance. She understood what needed to be done. Instead of yielding, she walked to the center of the chamber and placed her hand on the wooden box she carried. Slowly, she opened it, revealing the artifacts she had collected through her journey. The Nubian queen carved from wood, the terracotta mother of the Indus, the Minoan labyrinth, the warrior's bronze axe, the Greek spiral pendant. They glowed softly in the chamber's dim light, as though each object hummed with the energy of its origin. "These are not stories," she said. "These are lives. These are worlds. These are truths." She closed the box. "You may silence tablets, but you cannot silence memory. You cannot silence the stories that now live in the hearts of your children." For a long moment, the chamber was silent. Some officials were moved, others angered, but none could deny the truth in her words. Writing could be destroyed. Stories kept in living voices could not. Finally, the council dismissed her. They neither punished her nor accepted her ideas, but the shift had begun. A crack had formed in the stone walls of tradition, and through that crack, light seeped in. Over the following days, Shala devoted herself to teaching. She gathered people in the city's largest courtyard each evening, women, men, children, elders, all coming to hear her stories as though drawn by an invisible tide. Shala spoke of Enkidu, who wrote the world's first known poetry, of Mernith, who stabilized Egypt before the pyramids were conceived, of the Kandakes, who led Nubia with unshakable courage, of the Indus mothers whose hands shaped a peaceful society, of Minoan priestesses who danced the language of creation, of Fuhao, the warrior general feared by enemies across the Shang dynasty, of Greek priestesses who held wisdom older than myth.
Word of these gatherings spread beyond Uruk. Travelers carried Shala's stories along trade routes, across mountains, through deserts, overseas. Slowly, towns and cities began sharing their forgotten stories too. Women who had been silent for generations found their voices. Men began remembering the contributions of their mothers and grandmothers. Communities re-examined their traditions, not to abandon them, but to understand them more fully. History began to heal. One evening, Beled approached Shala with a proposal. He suggested they create a new archive, not of clay or stone, but of people. Instead of tablets stored in temples, they would train storytellers, teachers, midwives, artisans, and elders to preserve and pass down the stories of women from all lands. They would build a legacy that lived through breath, not brittle clay. Shala's heart swelled with hope. She agreed. Weeks passed, and soon a group of young learners gathered under Shala's guidance. She taught them what she had learned, the languages of symbols, the rhythm of oral storytelling, the ethics of preserving truth, the humility required to carry someone else's history. She taught them not to glorify, but to illuminate, not to replace one narrative with another, but to expand the boundaries of memory. Her grandmother proudly watched these gatherings, her eyes glowing with pride. Belid supported her every step. Yarita's teachings from Nubia, Mira's calm wisdom from the Indus, Therasio's knowledge from Crete, Xuan's lessons from the Shang, all blended into Shala's voice, turning her into a living atlas of civilizations. One night, while walking near the riverbank where she had once made her vow to carry forgotten stories, Shala sat down and opened her wooden box. The moon reflected off the water like a silver mirror, just as it had many months earlier. She placed the figurines, the axe, the labyrinth, and the spiral pendant on the ground beside her. Together, they formed a circle, 6 symbols from 6 worlds. She realized then that her journey had not been about distance, but connection. Each item represented a civilization. Each civilization represented a woman, and each woman represented humanity's shared origin. She whispered their names softly, letting the breeze carry them across the river. But as she sat there, something gently shifted inside her. For the first time, Shala did not feel the weight of memory as a burden. She felt it as a torch, one lit by each of the women before her, now placed in her hands. She understood what she must do next. The next morning, she gathered her students and announced that she would begin traveling again, not alone this time, but with a growing circle of storytellers. They would journey across villages and cities, teaching people to preserve women's stories in their own voices. They would gather forgotten tales from mothers, grandmothers, midwives, artisans, servants, priestesses, and warriors still living. They would weave memory back into the world, not through monuments, but through the living breath of community.
A new chapter began. Years passed. Uruk changed. The world shifted. And Shala grew older, her hair graying, but her voice never softening. Her students became teachers. Her teachers became legends. And her legacy spread across regions like ripples in an eternal river. She became known as the Keeper of Voices, a title whispered with reverence by generations who never met her, but felt the warmth of her stories in their hearts. On her final journey, long after her feet had traced the paths of many lands, Shala returned to the banks of the Euphrates. The wooden box still held the 6 sacred symbols, worn by time but never dimmed. She kneeled by the river and watched the water flow, steady, endless, ancient. She placed her hand on the figurines and smiled. "I kept my promise," she whispered. The wind carried her words far beyond the horizon. And so the stories lived on, woven into the dreams of countless people, carried from mother to daughter, teacher to student, friend to friend. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, monuments crumbled, but the voices of the women who built civilizations endured, because one girl once chose to listen. In the end, Shala's story became the final thread in the tapestry she had spent her life gathering, a thread woven not from power or conquest, but from remembrance, a thread made of fire, a thread that would never burn out.
Thanks for traveling through time with me today. If these ancient tales inspired you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next adventure.